The briefing room smelled like recycled air and someone's cold coffee, which was how Colonel Reyes knew it was going to be a long morning. She stood at the back of the tiered observation gallery, arms crossed, watching the 43 cadets file in below. They were the cream of the Interstellar Defense Collective's third intake, human volunteers mostly, with a handful of allied species representatives slotted in by diplomatic arrangement. All of them moved with the comfortable arrogance of people who had finished their tactical qualifications at the top of their cohort and knew it. Their gear was immaculate. Their posture was precise. Their uniforms carried the pale blue sheen of quantum weave armor underlay, which cost more than a year of a frontier colony's medical budget, and stopped in Vorthaki scatter-round at point-blank range. Reyes watched them settle into their seats and talk among themselves, 23 years old on average, smart, fast, absolutely certain that they had already seen everything worth seeing. She had felt exactly the same at their age. That had been a long time ago. The briefing room's main doors opened from the floor-level entrance, and the cadets' chatter died by degrees as the new figure walked in. He was not what any of them expected. The man who entered was perhaps 50, though it was difficult to say with certainty. He was of medium height and carried no obvious weapons. His face had the quality of weathered wood, all deep lines and patient stillness, with dark eyes that moved slowly across the room in the methodical way of someone cataloging exits. He wore black, deep, flat black that absorbed the room's overhead lighting rather than reflecting it. Not quantum weave, not impact polymer, not anything that any of the cadets appeared able to identify, because most of them were leaning toward their neighbors and whispering. The uniform was cloth, plain, unremarkable fitted cloth, with a wrapped sash at the waist and soft split-toe shoes that made no sound whatsoever on the hard floor. He stood at the front of the room and folded his hands in front of him and looked at the 43 cadets the way a man looks at whether he has no particular strong feelings about. In the third row, Cadet First Class Declan Morse, top of his hand-to-hand cohort, 2 departmental commendations, built like a weapons locker, leaned over to Cadet Surrey Vance and said, quietly but not quietly enough, "Is this a joke?" Vance pressed her lips together. "I think that's our instructor." "In that," Morse gestured at the man's clothing with 2 fingers, "my grandfather wore something like that to a harvest festival." The man at the front of the room turned his dark eyes toward Declan Morse and said nothing. The room became very quiet. Reyes uncrossed her arms. A second figure appeared in the doorway behind her, at the upper gallery level, tall, 3-jointed arms, the bone-pale coloring of the Vorthaki officer class. Commander Ashville of the IDC liaison staff, here on an observation rotation, studying the humans the way humans studied everything, with polite scientific interest and a private assumption of superiority. His secondary eyes, the amber pair, were fixed on the man in black below, and there was something in his expression that Reyes had learned to read in the past 8 months. He was not smiling. The Vorthaki smiled when they found something amusing. Ashville was not smiling. He was being careful. Reyes filed that away. The man at the front of the room said, "My name is Kenji Mura. For the next 6 weeks, I will be your instructor in close-quarters engagement doctrine. You may call me Instructor Mura. You may also call me Sir. Those are your 2 options." He paused. "The first session begins in 90 seconds. Anyone who is not paying attention at the 90-second mark will spend the first week running the outer perimeter at 0400. Nobody spoke. Good. The facility existed in 3 layers below the surface of Kepler Station, which itself orbited a brown dwarf at the comfortable remove of 3 light towers from the nearest shipping lane. It had been built to specification by people who understood that the best training facility was one that felt exactly like the worst possible situation you could find yourself in. The cadets had toured it during orientation week. The habitat rings, the pressurized combat simulators, the live fire ranges that recycled their own oxygen and smelled permanently of scorched metal. They had been impressed. The facility was state-of-the-art in every direction. Instructor Mura led them, on that first morning, past all of it. He took them to a sublevel that was not on the official map, a long corridor with bare walls, bare floor, bare overhead lights running in a single unbroken line toward a set of double doors at the far end. The doors were unmarked. The cadets looked at each other. Morse made a small noise that was almost a question. Mura opened the doors. The space beyond was vast, it had to be, given what it contained. What it contained was a maze. Not a metaphorical maze, not a training course dressed up with maze aesthetics, but a full architectural labyrinth of white-paneled corridors, 8 feet high, stretching across a floor plate that must have been 200 meters on each side. The overhead lighting was a deep neon blue, casting everything in the color of the deep ocean. At irregular intervals along the visible corridors, rays could see the faint pulse of marker lights. Amber, red, white, the warm gold of something she couldn't identify from this distance. Morse said audibly, "What is this?" Mura said, "Project Yellow Sphere, Phase 3. He did not look at Morse when he said it, he looked at the maze. This facility was built 9 years ago, following the first confirmed Vorthaki territorial incursion into the Procyon corridor. The architects of the incursion had one consistent tactical doctrine: superior numbers, superior firepower, and an absolute disdain for terrain. They do not use cover. They do not use misdirection. They do not, as a culture, value the individual combatant." He turned to face the cadets. "The question we were asked to answer, 9 years ago, was whether there existed a human combat methodology so alien to the Vorthaki tactical philosophy that their pattern recognition systems could not anticipate or counter it in real time." Cadet Vance said, "And the answer was a maze." Mura said, "The answer was me." He said it without ego. That was what made the room go quiet again. He said it the way someone states the barometric pressure. It was simply a fact, delivered for the purposes of accuracy. He continued, "The maze is a testing environment. What you are going to observe today is a capability demonstration. Afterward, I will answer questions." A pause. "Some of them." He walked to a side panel in the wall and opened it and stepped through, and the door closed behind him. The cadets stood in a cluster at the observation balcony that had materialized above the maze floor, and for 30 seconds nothing happened. Morse turned to the nearest cadet and opened his mouth. The maze erupted. It was not an eruption in the conventional military sense. There was no explosion, no discharge of energy weapons. What happened was that 12 Vorthaki combat drones, painted the characteristic pale colors of the alien armory, programmed to hunt at full tactical aggression, activated simultaneously from positions distributed throughout the labyrinth, and began moving toward the single heat signature at the maze's center. The cadets had their eyes on the thermal display built into the observation rail. One orange bloom, stationary, at the heart of the blue corridors below. And then the orange bloom moved. Not quickly, not in the frantic, scrambling way of something being chased. It moved the way smoke moves, with a consistency of direction that seemed impossible for something with joints and mass. It went left at the first junction when all tactical logic suggested going right. The right corridor was wider, better lit, led toward the exit. The bloom went left, and the amber marker light in that corridor went dark a second later, which meant one drone down. Morse said, "How did he?" and then stopped, because the bloom was already at the next junction. What the cadets were watching, though it would take most of them several weeks to find the vocabulary for it, was the intersection of two very different sciences. One was physics. One was something much older. Mura moved through the Vorthaki response pattern the way water moves through a cracked stone, not by overcoming it, but by finding every place where it was not and being there instead. He did not fight the drones directly. He arrived at positions from which they had already moved, which meant that by the time they recalculated his location, he was somewhere else entirely, and by the time they recalculated again, there were fewer of them to do the calculating. Drone 7 went dark, then 3, then 10. The thermal display was a map of negative space, the orange bloom surrounded by a steadily shrinking cloud of pale indicators, each one blinking out not with the burst signature of a weapon's hit, but with the quiet cessation of a system that had simply ceased to function, because something had reached inside it and removed a critical component. Cadet Vance was gripping the observation rail with both hands. Drone 2, Drone 9, Drone 1. And then the bloom was still again, at the center of the maze, and the last indicator on the display went dark, and the neon blue corridors below were empty of anything except one man in plain black cloth, standing with his hands folded, his breathing even, waiting. The whole sequence had taken 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Nobody in the observation gallery said anything for a long moment. Then Morse said he didn't run. Vance turned to look at him. When the drones activated, Morse said slowly, as if working something out, he didn't run, he just walked. He walked through them. Mura's voice came through the room speakers. Any questions? Morse raised his hand without thinking about it, which was, Ray's noted from her position in the upper gallery, perhaps the most honest thing she had seen him do all morning. Ashville found Ray's in the corridor outside the maze facility 3 hours later. He moved the way senior Vorthaki officers moved in the presence of humans when they wanted to communicate that they were, technically, on the same side while simultaneously maintaining every possible option. Smoothly, at a slight diagonal to the human's line of travel, which was a cultural signal for I wish to speak to you, but I have not yet decided how much. Ray's waited. Ashville said, the individual you have placed in charge of the close quarters cohort. Instructor Mura. He completed the maze demonstration in 4 minutes and 11 seconds against a full 12-unit Vorthaki tactical response package. The alien's 3-jointed hands were still. Our standard tactical response package is rated to neutralize a 4-person human special operations team in under 6 minutes in confined terrain. I know. One individual colonel, unarmored. I know that too. Ashville was quiet for a moment. His secondary amber eyes moved to the closed doors of the maze facility and then back to her. I reviewed his file this morning. He was not trained within the IDC system. No. He was trained in a tradition that the IDC's historical taxonomy classifies as pre-technological, non-mechanized. The file notation describes the tradition as a relic. Ray's looked at him. Ashville said, I am beginning to suspect the file notation was written by someone who had not seen him work. Most of the files were, she glanced at the doors. The Vorthaki don't have a word for what he is. Your language has a word for fighter, a word for soldier, a word for assassin in 3 dialect variants. None of them are the right word. Then what is the right word? Ninja, Ray said. It's an old one, older than most of the weapons in this facility. Older than most of the tactical doctrines your military command wrote their entire expansion strategy around. She looked back at him. They spent 300 years being told the world had passed them by. They spent those 300 years practicing anyway. Ashville was quiet for a longer moment than usual. I would like, he said carefully, to observe the second training session. The second session was harder to watch. Not because anything went wrong, because everything went right in ways that made the cadets feel like they were watching someone perform an action that should have been physically impossible, and finding themselves unable to identify the precise moment it became impossible. Mura worked slowly. That was the thing that took the longest to understand. He was demonstrating, not competing. He moved at roughly 60% of what the cadets were gradually realizing was his actual operational speed, and still none of them could reliably follow what he was doing. He was working with Cadet Tommaso Arriaga, who was the cohort's most decorated hand-to-hand practitioner, and had the physical build and reaction time of someone specifically engineered for close-quarters combat. Arriaga was good. Arriaga knew he was good. He approached the demonstration with the careful, controlled confidence of a man who expected to be tested and expected to perform well. Mura said, "Attack." Arriaga attacked. What happened next occupied perhaps 1.5 seconds. At the end of those 1.5 seconds, Arriaga was on the floor and Mura was standing where he had been standing before. Nothing visible had moved. No energy had been discharged. No sound had been made except a brief compressed exhale from Arriaga as the floor arrived sooner than expected. Arriaga looked at the ceiling for a moment. He said again. Mura said yes. The second attempt lasted slightly longer. The third attempt lasted the same amount of time as the first, which Arriaga found deeply frustrating. By the sixth attempt, the frustration had burned itself out into something cleaner, the particular quality of attention that the cadets were gradually being taught to recognize as the first useful thing a student brought to the room. Morse watched from 2 meters away and did the math and said nothing. On the 7th attempt, Arriaga changed tactics. Instead of committing to the attack directly, he feinted. A small, controlled deception, head and shoulder moving fractionally in the wrong direction before the real movement began. Mura stepped aside so precisely that he was already clear before the feint resolved. He had not reacted to the feint. He had not reacted to the real attack. He had simply been somewhere else, at exactly the right moment, as if the entire sequence had been agreed upon in advance. Arriaga sat down on the floor of his own accord this time. "How?" he said. "How do you know where I'm going before I go there?" Mura considered the question. He appeared to consider it genuinely, not as a teacher constructs a pause for effect, but as a craftsman considers a reasonable question about his tools. He said, "You told me." "I didn't." "You told me with your breathing. You told me with the distribution of your weight. You told me with the direction of your eyes 2 seconds before your body moved. You tell me everything, Cadet, before you have decided what you are going to do. The question is not how I know where you are going. The question is whether you have learned to stop announcing it." Arriaga looked at him. Mura said, "That is what this course is for." Ashville attended 6 of the first 8 sessions. He did not ask questions during them. He watched with the careful, specific attention of a military observer who had stopped thinking of what he was watching as an academic exercise and started thinking of it as a threat assessment. Reyes let him watch. She knew what he was doing. The Vorthaki Alliance had 1,700 years of continuous military history and an institutional culture that processed new information through the lens of that history, which meant that anything genuinely new took a very long time to categorize. Ashville was trying to categorize Mura. He was finding, she suspected, that the existing categories did not fit. The existing categories were built on a fundamental assumption, that a combatant's effectiveness scaled with the sophistication of their tools. Better weapons, better armor, better communication systems, these were the variables that the Vorthaki Alliance had optimized for across 17 centuries. A warrior without quantum weave armor was a less effective warrior. A warrior without energy weapons was a less effective warrior. These were not opinions. They were engineering facts, verified by 1,700 years of continuous military history. What Mura was doing did not fit those facts. He was walking through walls, in the conceptual sense. He was operating in the space between the Vorthaki tactical framework's assumptions and finding, apparently, that this space was larger than the framework had budgeted for. On the 9th session, Ashville asked his first question. "The technique you used on Cadet Arriaga in Session 4, he said. He was standing at the edge of the training floor, and the cadets had been dismissed, and Mura was wiping condensation from the back of a practice blade with a small square of cloth. The entry at the inside line, with the weight displacement at the hip rather than the shoulder. You're an H variant, Mura said. It is not in any human military manual. I have been cleared to review. It's not in any military manual. Where is it then? Mura folded the cloth and put it away. He looked at Ashville with those patient dark eyes and said, "It is in a text written by a man named Jigoro Kano in the late 19th century of Earth's standard calendar. The technique is approximately 1100 years old." Ashville was very still for a moment. "You are using 1100-year-old combat methodology against Vorthaki tactical response systems." "I am using it against everyone," Mura said. "The tactical response systems find it somewhat more disorienting than a human opponent would. There are reasons for that." "And what are the reasons?" Mura considered him. The same patient, genuine consideration he gave Arriaga's questions, with no trace of condescension. He said, "Your tactical systems are built on pattern libraries. Every movement they observe is compared against a very large library of known movements, and the closest match determines the response. The library was built on data from human, Vorthaki, and allied species combat. Thousands of engagements, millions of individual movement samples." He paused. "The library does not contain this." He made a very small movement, perhaps 15 degrees of rotation at the wrist, combined with a fractional shift in stance. Nothing that looked like a technique. Nothing that registered as an action at all. Ashville's secondary eyes tracked it, caught it, lost it. "The library was built on data from the last 200 years, Mura said. "What I practice is somewhat older than that." 6 weeks in, the cadets were different people. Not transformed. That was a word Reyes distrusted, because it implied a before and after cleanness that real learning never had. They were the same people, with the same histories, the same individual skills and gaps and stubbornnesses. But they moved differently. They thought differently about movement, which was not the same as moving differently but was a necessary step toward it. Morse still led with his physical size. He probably always would. But he had started to also listen before he committed, which was a more significant change than it sounded, because Morse's listening face looked exactly like Morse's about to explode face, and the distinction took several weeks to learn. Arriaga had become, in Reyes's estimation, the most dangerously balanced combatant in the cohort. He had the physical gifts, and he had added to them a quality of patience that was genuinely unusual in someone his age. He had stopped trying to win training exchanges and started trying to understand them, which was the difference between a weapon and someone who knew how to use one. Vance had surprised everyone, including herself. Her tactical instincts were exceptional. She saw space the way the best chess players saw the board, not the pieces that were there but the pieces that weren't, the open squares, the potential. Mura had worked with her in Session 11 on what he called the negative geometry of a fight, which was not a phrase that appeared in any standard IDC manual, and afterward Vance had sat alone for 40 minutes, and then come back with 3 questions that Reyes overheard from the gallery and recognized as the best questions anyone had asked in 6 weeks. And the training was changing them in another way that Reyes watched more carefully than she watched the technique development. They had stopped laughing at the cloth uniform, stopped whispering, not because Mura had said anything about it. He had never addressed it. He had simply shown them with great patience and absolute consistency what the cloth uniform meant, what it contained, what it represented in terms of years and discipline, and a quality of human stubbornness that had looked out at a universe that said you are obsolete and replied not yet. On the last evening of the 6-week cycle, Reyes came down to the training floor while Mura was resetting the practice equipment. He moved through the task the way he moved through everything, without wasted motion, each action complete in itself. She said, the cohort's final assessment is in 12 hours. I know. Ashville is attending. I know that too. She watched him work for a moment. He filed an independent observation report with the Alliance technical staff. I was copied. He recommends that the yellow sphere methodology be classified at a higher clearance level and that distribution be limited pending a full strategic analysis. Mura said nothing. He's not wrong to be concerned, Reyes said, from his perspective. From his perspective, Mura agreed. He said in the report that he found the methodology, and I'm reading directly, fundamentally destabilizing to established interspecies conflict resolution frameworks. She paused, which is a technical way of saying it scares them. Mura finished aligning the last practice blade and turned to look at her. We scare them. You specifically. He considered that. One person scaring a 1700-year military alliance seems like a resource allocation problem on their end. Reyes smiled. It was a small smile. The problem isn't you specifically. The problem is you're not specific. You're a method. Methods can be taught. She looked at the 43 assessment folders on the table beside him. 43 cadets who now know how to think the way you think. Or the beginning of that. Mura looked at the folders. The Vorthaki strategic doctrine, he said slowly, assumes a certain ratio of technology advantage to human numbers. They have run that calculation for 200 years, and the calculation has always favored them. A pause. The calculation doesn't account for this. No, Ray said, it doesn't. The final assessment ran for 9 hours. The Vorthaki tactical response package had been upgraded for the occasion, 14 drones instead of 12, with improved pattern recognition software sourced, according to the technical manifest, from the most recent field deployment hardware. Ashville stood in the observation gallery with a technical liaison and a recording apparatus and watched. The cadets went through in pairs, then triads, then a final full cohort sequence that the assessment designers had given a 5% completion probability. The cohort completed it. Not cleanly. Morse took a drone impact in the second triad sequence that would have been a significant injury in a live engagement. Arriaga's pair lost 30 seconds on a junction decision that cost them a recovery window. 2 cadets whose names Reyes kept having to look up, both quiet, technically solid, never the most visible, turned in individual performances that were among the best she had seen in 12 years of running yellow sphere assessments. And Vance. Vance moved through the final cohort sequence like she had designed it, which was not the way it worked but was the way it looked, and the technical liaison standing next to Ashville said something in Vorthaki that the translation system rendered, perhaps imprecisely, as she is in the wrong position for the drone's sensor range, which is not a human tactical concept, and the liaison did not explain how it had been learned. Ashville watched. When it was done, when the final assessment scores were logged, and the cadets were standing on the maze floor breathing hard and bleeding from minor impacts in 2 cases and grinning at each other, in the slightly unhinged way of people who have just done something they weren't certain was possible, Ashville descended from the gallery. He found Mura at the edge of the floor. He said, I have been a military observer for 31 standard years. Mura waited. In 31 years, I have observed 47 training programs across 9 species designations and 3 alliance tiers. He looked at the cadets. He looked at Morse, who was demonstrating something to Arriaga with his hands, something that looked like the urine age entry, the weight at the hip, not the shoulder, getting it almost right. I have never recommended that a training methodology receive emergency strategic classification. Until today, Reyes said from behind him. Ashville turned to her. I submitted a revised recommendation this morning. I withdrew the classification proposal. Reyes waited. The classification would be counterproductive, Ashville said. The methodology cannot be unmade. The cadets who know it cannot unknow it. The most rational response to a paradigm shift is not to seal the room it came from. He paused. I also, upon reflection, found the original recommendation somewhat cowardly. He looked at Mura. I would like to know, he said, whether the program accepts observers from allied species as candidates. The question landed in the room like a stone in still water. The cadets had gone quiet. Arriaga had his hand half raised in the position Morse had been demonstrating and had stopped moving entirely. Mura looked at Ashville for a long moment. He said, the course is physically demanding. I am aware. The methodology was developed for human physiology over approximately 1,000 years. Adaptation for a three-jointed skeletal structure will require significant modification of foundational techniques. I understand. The first month will consist primarily of falling down. Ashville's primary eyes met Mura's. I am not unfamiliar with falling down. Mura said, no, I don't imagine you are. He turned back to the training floor where the cadets were watching him. He looked at them the way he had looked at them on that first morning, without performance, without theater, with the patient attention of someone who had spent a very long time learning how to see exactly what was in front of him, and no more and no less. He said, that was a good day, go eat, be back at 0600. The war, when it came, did not look like anyone's war game. It came 18 months after the final yellow sphere assessment. It came in the Procyon corridor, where the Vorthaki had tested boundaries for years, and then it came everywhere else at once, because that was how the Vorthaki preferred to operate. Let the edges be tested until the response pattern is clear, then commit the full weight in a single coordinated action. The IDC command projections had estimated 6 weeks to reach a stable front line. The actual timeline was 11 days, during which the Vorthaki advanced through 3 contested systems and established orbital superiority over 7 inhabited stations. On day 12, the Yellow Sphere teams deployed. Reyes was at the Tactical Operations Center on Kepler Station when the first field reports came in, and she watched them the way she had watched Mura's first maze demonstration, with the specific attention of someone cataloging things that their existing mental framework was struggling to contain. The teams were small. That was the first thing. Every doctrine the IDC had developed in 200 years of interspecies conflict was based on unit cohesion, the principle that humans were effective in aggregates, that the individual combatant's significance scaled with the size of the force around them. The Yellow Sphere teams were 2, 3, 4 people, sometimes 1. The Vorthaki tactical systems could not build a reliable response pattern from engagements that lasted an average of 40 seconds and left no recoverable forensic signature. Arriaga's team took down a Vorthaki communications relay on Station Epsilon 7 in a sequence that the after-action reconstruction, undertaken by 3 separate IDC technical analysts, concluded was geometrically improbable. The team had moved through the relay's defense perimeter in a configuration that the defense perimeter's own sensor package had been designed to detect and had not, apparently, detected, because the configuration involved the team occupying the sensor package's exact blind spots, in a sequence that the sensor package's designers had not considered, because the sequence required a degree of spatial awareness that the designers had not budgeted for in a human tactical unit. Vance's team did something with a Vorthaki command structure's communications array that Reyes read about in the technical debrief, and then read again, and then called the debrief author to confirm that she had understood correctly. And the debrief author said yes, confirmed, and was quiet for a moment before adding that he had been a tactical analyst for 19 years and had not previously seen that specific approach used with those specific results. And Reyes said she understood and ended the call and sat with the knowledge for a while. Morse, blunt, physical Morse, who led with his size and always had adapted the urinage entry to low-gravity engagement geometry in a way that Reyes suspected Mura had not specifically taught but had made possible, the way a good teacher makes possible things they have not specifically anticipated. He used it in a corridor engagement on a Vorthaki supply depot in circumstances that the official report described as suboptimal, and that the surviving Vorthaki unit described, when interviewed, as something they could not account for. The phrase they used, the translation system's best rendering of a Vorthaki expression that apparently had no direct equivalent, was, "He was in the wrong place at the wrong time." He was always in the wrong place at the wrong time, and we could not find the right place to be instead. Reyes sent that translation to Mura, who was with a second cohort training group and not in the field. He read it and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Yes, that's the idea." On the 63rd day of the engagement, Ashville deployed. He had been through 8 months of yellow sphere training, much slower than the human cadets, for the reasons Mura had described, the 3-jointed skeletal structure, the foundational techniques needing reconstruction from the ground up. He had fallen down more times than he had counted, and had stopped counting when it became clear the counting was not useful. He had asked good questions and had received good answers, and had worked through the adaptations with a focused patience that Mura had noted in the assessment file with a single word: excellent. He deployed in support of a mixed species unit assigned to the Procyon Corridor's intertransit zone, and his field reports were models of tactical clarity until day 65, when the report stopped for 14 hours, which was the period during which his unit was engaged in a close-quarters action inside a Vorthaki staging complex, the geometry of which bore a distinct resemblance to the maze at Kepler Station. He had spent 8 months learning to move through mazes. The reports resumed on day 66. The staging complex had been cleared. The unit was intact. Ashville's own field notation for the action was 4 sentences, the last of which was, "I was in the wrong place at the wrong time." The second cohort training group was 51 cadets. The third cohort intake was being processed. Mura was standing in the sublevel corridor when Reyes found him, 3 hours before the third cohort's first session. He was looking at the doors to the maze facility with his hands folded in front of him, which was how he looked when he was thinking. Reyes stood beside him. She had a datapad with the third cohort's intake profiles, which she had reviewed and found, as she found them every cycle, simultaneously impressive and instructive about the distance still to be covered. Young, qualified, certain they had seen everything worth seeing. She said, 53 this time. "I know." The Alliance technical staff submitted a request for curriculum documentation. They want to build a parallel training track. "I know that too." "The general said to tell you." She paused. "He said you'd probably already seen the summary." Mura smiled. The smile was small and brief, and had in it the specific quality of someone who has been doing something quietly for a very long time and watched it become, against all institutional expectation, necessary. He looked like a man who had spent decades being told by a universe that his methods were outdated and had simply, consistently, declined to agree. Reyes looked at the maze doors. She said, "They're going to ask again. When they see the uniform." Mura said, "They always ask." "What do you tell them, the ones who ask seriously?" He considered the question. He looked at the doors. He looked at what was behind them, the vast neon blue labyrinth where 12 drones had ceased to function, because a man in plain cloth had moved through them with 1,100 years of practiced knowledge, and the specific stubbornness of a tradition that had refused to accept its own obsolescence. He said, "I tell them the cloth doesn't stop bullets." And they say, "Yes, we know, so why?" "And what do you tell them then?" He turned to look at her. The dark eyes, patient as always, the face like weathered wood. The hands folded precisely in front of him, each finger in its correct position, the posture of someone who is completely comfortable with stillness in a universe that rewards motion. "I tell them the cloth isn't armor," he said. "It never was. The armor is what's underneath the cloth." He turned back to the doors. "The armor is the 1100 years. The armor is every morning before dawn, every session in an empty room, every time a student fell down and stood back up and asked the question again. The armor is the argument made by every person who learned this and taught it and kept it alive, that knowing something deeply is not the same as being obsolete." He paused. "The cloth is just cloth. But the cloth means all of that to the people who know what it means." Reyes looked at him. "And to the people who don't know," she said. "That's what the first session is for." He opened the doors. 53 cadets were waiting on the other side. They looked at his uniform, and some of them were already leaning toward their neighbors. He waited for the room to settle. It settled. He said, "My name is Kenji Mura. For the next 6 weeks, I will be your instructor in close quarters engagement doctrine." And somewhere in the back of a room, full of young people who were absolutely certain they had already seen everything worth seeing, someone who had not yet learned how little that certainty was worth leaned over and whispered something that made the person next to them try not to smile. Mura looked at the back of the room. He waited. The room went quiet. He said, "Good." Then he turned and opened the doors to the maze and led them in. The war did not end at Procyon. Wars never ended where they started. They found new geography, new excuses, new places where the calculation of risk and advantage briefly tipped toward engagement. The Vorthaki Alliance had 1700 years of military history and the patience that came with it. They could absorb a setback in the Procyon corridor and recalibrate, which was precisely what the IDC strategic staff had projected they would do, and precisely what they did. The recalibration took 4 months. In those 4 months, 3 things happened that mattered. The first was that the Yellow Sphere program expanded, not loudly, not with the fanfare that institutional programs use to justify their budgets. It expanded the way water expands into available space, quietly, thoroughly, into every gap in the IDC training architecture that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting for something to fill it. A 4th cohort, a 5th. Parallel tracks at 2 additional facilities, run by graduates of the first 3 cohorts who had been through enough sessions to understand what they were teaching well enough to teach it. Arriaga ran the secondary track at Kepler Station. He was 25. He taught the way Mura taught, without performance, without the competitive energy of someone trying to demonstrate superiority. He taught by making the material visible, which was harder than it looked and required a quality of selflessness that was rare in people who were very good at things, the ability to make the thing more important than the person teaching it. He told his first cohort, on their first morning, a story. He told them about the first session he had attended, the man in plain black cloth, the maze, the 12 minutes of silence from a room full of people who had been absolutely certain they had seen everything worth seeing. He told them about the 7th attempt, about the feint that had not worked, about sitting down on the floor and asking how. He told them what Mura had said. "You told me with your breathing. You told me with the distribution of your weight." He said, "Every one of you is telling me everything right now. I can hear your confidence. I can hear where you expect this to go. I can hear what you think is going to happen in this room over the next 6 weeks." He looked at them. "My job is to make that harder to do. Your job is to make it harder to do to yourselves." He waited. Someone in the 3rd row said, "That doesn't make sense." Arriaga said, "It will." The second thing that happened in the 4 months of recalibration was that the Vorthaki Alliance did something they had never done in 1700 years of continuous military history. They studied a human. Not human technology, not human numbers or human logistics or the human habit of treating supply lines as secondary considerations, until the moment they became catastrophic primary considerations. Those things had been studied. The Vorthaki strategic staff understood human military hardware better than most humans did, which was the intended consequence of 200 years of careful intelligence work. They studied Kenji Mura. The intelligence effort was significant. They pulled every available record, his training history, his competition record sparse. He did not compete, as a rule, his teaching record, his field assignments, the small number of documented engagement reports from the rare occasions when he had been in a live situation. They built a profile. The profile was reviewed by the Vorthaki Alliance's Senior Tactical Analysis Team. The Senior Tactical Analysis Team's conclusion, which was marked at the highest classification level and circulated to no more than 11 individuals, was as follows. The individual designated Project Yellow Sphere is not, in the conventional military sense, a threat. He is one person, unaugmented, operating in cloth rather than armor, without energy weapons, without tactical support systems. In a conventional engagement, his threat profile is within normal parameters for a human special operations individual. The conclusion continued. The threat is not the individual. The threat is what the individual represents, a methodology that our pattern libraries cannot currently process, distributed into an expanding number of trained human combatants. The individual can be neutralized. The methodology cannot, by any means currently available to us, be unlearned by the humans who have learned it. The 11th individual to receive the report wrote a single notation in the margin. This is the first time in 1700 years that we have issued a classified threat assessment about an idea. That notation was not included in the official record. The third thing that happened was that Ashville came back. He came back on a diplomatic transit, which was technically what his travel documents said. And technically, he did have a diplomatic meeting scheduled. And technically, the diplomatic meeting occupied about 40 minutes of a 3-day visit, during which he spent the majority of his time in the training facility sublevel. He was better than he had been. That was the honest assessment. He had continued working during the deployment and the months after it, practicing the foundational adaptations in whatever space was available, which was not always much space, and was sometimes no space at all, which meant he had worked on the internal elements. The breathing, the attention, the particular quality of listening that Mura called negative awareness, and that Ashville had no direct translation for in his own language, and had eventually stopped trying to translate. He showed Mura the work. Mura watched. He did not perform the watching, he simply watched. With the complete attention he gave everything, the kind of attention that made it clear that whatever was happening in front of him was the only thing happening anywhere. After some time he said, "The hip entry. It's still early. Show me the alternative you found." Ashville showed him. It was not the urinage variant, because urinage assumed a shoulder structure that Vorthaki physiology did not have in the same configuration. It was something that had started as urinae and been rebuilt from principle rather than form. The same logic in a different skeleton, the same weight and timing and geometry arrived at through a completely different physical vocabulary. Mura watched it twice. He said, "Who taught you this?" Ashville said, "You did, in principle." Mura was quiet for a moment. He looked at the 3-jointed arms, the 4 eyes, the bone-pale coloring of the Vorthaki officer class, and he looked at the movement that had just been demonstrated, which was built on a framework he had spent 30 years constructing, and which someone from a completely different evolutionary history had adapted in 8 months of practice under field conditions. He said, "Yes, I suppose I did." "Is it correct?" Mura turned away and walked to the equipment wall. He came back with 2 practice tools. He placed one of them in Ashville's 3-fingered hand and stood back. He said, "Show me again, slower." The second engagement began on a Tuesday, as far as the IDC calendar was concerned, though the engagement itself did not care about the calendar. It came in the Kepler 22 transit zone, which was the approach to the station, which was where Mura was, which was not a coincidence in any meaningful sense because the Vorthaki strategic staff had, in their 4 months of recalibration, studied the threat assessment and arrived at the obvious tactical conclusion. Remove the source. It was a reasonable doctrine. Mura himself would have called it reasonable. You identify the root of a problem and you address the root. The difficulty was in the execution, because the execution required getting close to Kenji Mura, and getting close to Kenji Mura while intending to do something about him was an exercise that the available historical data suggested was not straightforward. The Vorthaki sent a specialist team, 7 individuals, from a unit that the intelligence briefings described as the equivalent of a human Tier 1 special operations group, which was a comparison that would have meant more if the Vorthaki unit had any experience engaging someone trained in the yellow sphere methodology. They did not. The methodology was 9 years old, and the intelligence sharing between the Vorthaki tactical community and the rest of the known universe on this particular subject was, for obvious reasons, limited. The station went to partial lockdown at 0300. The 7 specialists were in the facility by 0322, which was considered an excellent insertion time and was. They found the maze facility sublevel at 0341. What they found in the maze facility sublevel was the maze, lit in its characteristic neon blue, and nothing else. The heat signatures that their sensors were reading, 1 human, 1 Vorthaki, were present and stationary at coordinates deep within the labyrinth. The team entered. The door closed behind them. In the observation gallery above, Ray said quietly to the security officer beside her, "Timer." The security officer said, "Running." Reyes looked at the thermal display. The 2 stationary heat signatures at the heart of the maze had not moved. She said, "How long have those signatures been stationary?" The security officer checked his panel. He said, "Since 0215. Reyes said, "They knew." The security officer said, "Ma'am." She looked at the display, at the 7 incoming indicators moving through the neon blue corridors, and the 2 stationary signatures at the center, and she thought about everything Mura had said about negative awareness, about the space between intentions and actions, about the geometry of what was not there. She thought about a man who had spent 30 years learning to hear things before they were said. She said, "Start the after-action documentation now. We're going to want it contemporaneous." The after-action documentation recorded 11 minutes and 44 seconds. At 11 minutes and 44 seconds, the display showed 0 moving indicators within the maze. The 2 stationary signatures at the center remained. They had not moved at any point during the 11 minutes and 44 seconds. The security officer said after a moment, "How?" Reyes looked at the display and thought about Morse asking the same question, the first time, in a room full of people who had not yet understood that the question was going to take years to answer properly, and that years was, in the context of what was being learned, a reasonable timeline. She said, "He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was always in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they couldn't find the right place to be instead." The security officer looked at her. She said, "Write that down. Use those words. The debriefs will ask." Mura came out of the maze at 0451 and stood in the empty sublevel corridor with his hands folded and his breathing even, and Reyes was there, because she had been waiting. She said, "You knew." He said, "I heard the insertion team at 0130. The ventilation pattern changed. Someone entered the sublevel 3 hours before they came into the maze. You waited in there for 3 hours." "Ashville waited with me. He needed the practice." Reyes looked at him. 3 hours in the maze, waiting for 7 Vorthaki specialists, and you called it practice. It was practice. He looked at the doors. It is always practice, that's the point. She did not ask what the point was. She already knew, because the point was the same point it had always been, the same argument made by every morning session before dawn in every empty room for 1,000 years, that knowing something deeply was not the same as being obsolete, that the cloth was just cloth, that the armor was everything else. The second engagement, she said, it's going to be larger than Procyon. Yes. How many cohorts do we need? He turned and looked back through the maze doors, at the neon blue corridors that stretched to the vanishing point, at the amber and red and gold marker lights pulsing in the depths of the labyrinth. He thought about 43 cadets on a first morning. He thought about Ariaga on the floor asking the question again. He thought about Vance gripping the observation rail. He thought about Ashville's adaptation, built from principle rather than form, the same logic in a different skeleton. He said, as many as the world will give us time to train. He turned back to her. He said, in the meantime, we begin tomorrow. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, the cadets call you when you're not in the room. They have a name for you. I don't know if you know. He waited. They call you the instructor, she said. Capital I, like a title, like there's only one. A pause. Ariaga's cohort started doing it too, and the Kepler 22 group. Mura said nothing. I asked Ariaga what it meant to them. He said, she paused. He said it's not about the rank, it's not about the assignment. It's about what you represent, the whole idea of it, the stubbornness of the thing. She looked at his plain black uniform. He said it means the person who stayed in the room when everyone else moved on. Mura looked down at his hands. The hands of someone who had spent 30 years making a very specific set of movements, 10,000 times each, in empty rooms before dawn, until the movements were no longer something he did, but something he was. He said, tell him to get some sleep. He turned and walked back through the doors. They closed behind him without a sound. Somewhere deep in the neon blue corridors, the amber markers pulsed. The maze waited. It was always waiting. That was the nature of the maze. It did not come to you. It was there when you arrived, patient and complex and indifferent to your expectations. And what it tested was not your strength or your speed or the sophistication of your armor. It tested whether you had learned, deeply enough and honestly enough, to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Not because someone told you where to be. Because you had spent enough years in empty rooms that the right place had stopped being something you calculated and started being something you knew. The door stayed closed. The training began. The 6th cohort was different. Every cohort was different, in the way that groups of people are always different from each other, different histories, different strengths, different places where the work would be hard and the places where it would be easy. But the 6th cohort was different in a way that took Mura several sessions to name. They were afraid. Not of him, or not primarily of him. They were afraid of the war. It was present in the station in a way it had not been when the first cohort arrived, in the news feeds, in the faces of people on the transport decks, in the specific quality of quiet that falls over communities when the conflict they have been following as an abstraction suddenly resolves into something concrete and proximate. The Kepler 22 engagement had been 2 transit zones away. That was not far as war went. That was not far at all. Mura watched them file in on that first morning and felt the fear the way he felt everything, through the weight distribution, the breathing, the particular quality of stillness that was not ease but effort. They were working hard to look calm. They were not calm. He said, "You're afraid." Nobody answered. He said, "That's correct. You should be afraid." He looked across the room. Fear is accurate information. The error is not in feeling it. The error is in letting it make your decisions before you have. A cadet in the second row, young, very young, 17 at most, said, "How do you stop it from doing that?" Mura looked at her. He said, "What's your name?" "Cadet Lena Park." "Where are you from, Cadet Park?" "Epsilon Station, the outer ring." The outer ring of Epsilon Station was within 4 transit zones of Kepler 22. The cadets on either side of her were looking carefully at nothing. Mura said, "The fear doesn't stop. I want to be very clear about that because someone will tell you it stops and they will be lying." He looked at her. "What changes is the relationship. The fear is information. You are in control of what you do with information." He paused. "That is what this course is for." Park said, "How long did it take you?" He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I am still working on it." The room was very quiet. Then Uriaga, who had come in at the back and been standing there for 10 minutes, which Mura had noted without looking, said from the doorway, "He's not lying. I watched him wait in the maze for 3 hours." Heads turned. "He didn't pace," Uriaga said. "He didn't check his equipment, he just stood there." He looked at the cadets. "I was terrified the whole time. He was just there, present." He paused. "I asked him afterward how he did it and he said something about the cloth not being the armor." He looked at Mura. "I'm still working out what that means." Mura said, "You have time. We were in a maze waiting for a kill team. You still have time, you made it out." He turned back to the 6th cohort. "That is the other thing fear teaches you if you let it. It teaches you the precise value of the time you have." He looked at Cadet Park. "It teaches you not to waste it." Park was looking at him with the expression that Reyes, watching from the gallery above, had learned to recognize as the beginning of something. Not certainty, not confidence, but the first honest acknowledgement that there was something worth learning, and that learning it was going to take longer than expected, and that this was not a reason not to start. Mura said, 90 seconds. The room settled. He said, "Good." There was a moment, later in the 6th cohort's 3rd week, that Reyes wrote about in her personal log and then deleted and then rewrote and kept, because it was the kind of moment that deserved to be written down even if the only person who would ever read it was herself. It was the end of a session. The cadets had been worked hard. Session 13 was always hard, because Session 13 was the first time the full maze protocol ran with the cadets inside it and the drones live, and the protocol did not have a 5% completion rate like the first cohort's final assessment. Session 13 had a 0% completion rate because it was not designed to be completed. It was designed to show the cadets exactly where they were. Where they were at Session 13 was a place most of them found uncomfortable. Mura stood at the edge of the floor and watched them come out of the maze. Some of them were angry. Some of them were quiet in the particular way of people who are processing. Cadet Park was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her arms on her knees, which was the posture of someone who had given everything and found at the end of it that everything had not been enough. Mura walked over and sat down on the floor next to her. Not beside her in the teacher-conferring way, just sat down, on the floor, in his plain black cloth, with the ease of someone who was completely comfortable sitting on floors. Park said after a moment, "I failed." He said, "Yes. I made the wrong call at Junction 7. I had the data. I read it wrong." "Yes. How do I fix it?" He said, "You already know how to fix it." She looked at him. He said, "You did the autopsy. You found the junction. You identified the data and the error. You know what the correct reading was." He paused. "What you're asking me is how you make sure you read it correctly next time under pressure when there are drones in the corridor and someone is counting on your decision." He looked at her. "The answer is, you practice until the correct reading is faster than the fear." Park said, "How long does that take?" He said, "Longer than 6 weeks." She looked at him. "Then what's the point of 6 weeks?" "The point of 6 weeks," Mura said, "is that it starts somewhere. The point of 6 weeks is that a year from now, or 2 years, or 10, you will be in a junction that matters and you will make the correct call, and you will not know precisely which morning session made it possible, but all of them will have. He paused. The work is long. The beginning of the work is not the same as the end of the work. Park was quiet for a moment. She said, "You've been doing this for 30 years. 32. Are you at the end?" He looked at the maze doors, at the neon blue light leaking under the gap at the floor. He thought about what Arriaga had said, the cloth not being the armor. He thought about Ashville's adaptation, built from principle rather than form. He thought about the 1100 years before him, every empty room, every morning before dawn, every person who had practiced the thing and taught it and kept it alive past every moment when the world decided it was obsolete. He said, "I don't think there's an end." Park looked at him. He said, "I think that's the point of it." She sat with that for a while. Then she stood up and he stood up beside her, and they walked back toward the maze. And behind them the rest of the 6th cohort was already resetting, already asking questions, already finding the hunger underneath the failure that was the only reliable sign that someone was going to become something worth becoming. The neon blue light pulsed. The training began again.